Well, Jeffrey, how are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing pretty good. I just got back from DEF CON, so a little tired, a little excited, a little everywhere, but feeling great.
Good stuff, good stuff. Well, thanks so much for taking the time the day after DEF CON to come on the show. Um, Jeffrey, do you mind giving a brief bio and some of the big ideas you're interested in?
Yeah. Um, well, I've been thinking a lot about what's going to happen in the future. So a lot of my work and thinking has been pretty focused on that question. And some of this is like just the existential risk question of like, are we going to make it? And if not, what could possibly sort of knock us off course? And so, yeah, really since college, so I studied evolutionary biology in college, and I was thinking about like how species go extinct. And I'm like, oh yeah, could that happen to us? Like, yeah, probably. But like we're a pretty weird and unusual species. So it's like, if we were to go extinct, it's an interesting question of like what might cause that. And it seems like the most likely thing that would cause that is not like an asteroid strike or some external thing, but rather something that we cause ourselves, just because we're so powerful. And like, it's actually pretty interesting because I feel like, yeah, like people are very, very worried about climate change, and like climate change is quite worrying in a lot of respects. But like the same thing that makes climate change scary, which is that we can like have these huge effects on the environment, also makes us as a species pretty safe from climate change. Like because it's like, yeah, it's going to change things like sea levels can rise, things can get really hot, weather can change all around, agricultural shifts can happen. But like all of these things have happened in human history before, and like humanity survived, and that was like at tech levels that were like way below our own. So we're actually like extremely robust in a way that's really cool. So even though we can like totally mess things up a lot, we can also survive a lot of things. So yeah, I like I think this is actually sort of the like high level of a lot of my thinking was like going through each like big risk category and then trying to figure out like, oh, could we survive this? Could we not survive this? And so it's like climate change, yeah, we can probably survive it. Like nuclear war, ooh, that one's like a little tougher because like nukes are really powerful. I just got back. So when I was in Las Vegas for DEF CON, I visited the National Atomic Testing Museum.
Oh, nice.
It was amazing.
Yeah.
Got and it sort of starting with Trinity, all the way up to like the atmospheric testing ban. They moved everything underground. They started doing underground testing. I think it was Bravo, which is like the biggest nuclear test. This is like in the Pacific, where they tested what they thought was going to be a 5 megaton bomb, turned out to be a 14 megaton bomb because they had like miscalculated how a certain isotope would respond. I mean, that is like such a huge difference.
Yes.
Yeah. So like we're nukes are just like such a powerful technology, and people have hypothesized about different big effects, the radiological effects, and the climate effects. You could potentially get a nuclear winter that could cause significant cooling. And so I spent a few years looking at this question, not like mostly just looking at the existing literature, trying to think of it from first principles, talk to people who had done research in the space, and I think I have a pretty like wide like distribution of probabilities around like how bad it could be. But I think even in the pretty like near worst case scenarios, we're still pretty likely to survive. So, like, don't get me wrong, nuclear war would be devastating, could really set civilization back for a while. But I think even in the pretty bad cases, we're just so good at surviving, and like we're really smart, and we have there's lots of different knowledge distributed in lots of different places in the world. And so even if it takes hundreds of years, like on an evolutionary timescale, that's not a lot of time. So, good news,
Recoverable.
in my mind, recoverable. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And then. Yeah, and then more recently, I looked at this a lot with like biotechnology, risks from biotechnology, which is where I think you start to get into the realm of like, oh, there might be some things we could do that we wouldn't survive. And then more recently, still like looking at artificial intelligence. And yeah, once you start to have like adversarial pressure that tries to prevent you from surviving, that's where it gets really, really dangerous. Because it's like, if it's the environment changing, the environment isn't optimizing to prevent you from existing. But if you have like a very intelligent agent that is like misaligned, then you start to have real problems, especially if it's more smarter than you, more capable than you. Like if we wanted to go like, humans are a great example of this, where like we have rats on islands we don't want to have rats on. Like we accidentally introduced them to the island, and like we just wiped out whole giant rat populations off islands because we didn't want them there. And we're like oh, they like keep evading these poisons. Let's use these other poisons. And so, yeah, it's not a situation you ever want to be in. So, yeah. So I guess, yeah, I mean, this is a high level view, walking through sort of different risks from different technologies, thinking about how they might affect us. But I don't know. I don't just think about ways in which we could all, everything could fail. In terms of mostly what I'm doing right now professionally, it's in the information security world, trying to prevent hackers from hacking AI systems and sort of proliferating this technology. Also a bit of that in the biotech space, trying to keep, sort of dangerous biotechnology contained. But I don't just think about that. I'm also really excited about what the future could look like. Like some of these technologies that are like, present these really big risks also present these really like amazing opportunities. And I think if you look at sort of like where we are right now in terms of like civilization and technology and society, things could be like vastly better. I think people like totally don't get it in terms of how good things could be. Like things are, I don't know, in my life, I'm like, my life's pretty good. But if I sort of flip that coin, I'm like, well, I am probably headed towards like age-related illness. Like even if I stay really healthy and like do everything totally right, when I'm 80, 90, 100, yeah, like that's going to fail. All of my systems are going to fail. I might get dementia. And like my grandparents have dementia right now, and it really sucks. Like it's really sad. It's like super tragic. These like loving, caring, smart people just like losing their ability to remember their own context, and it's super sad. They lose their autonomy. They lose their freedom. And so when people right now are like, death isn't so bad, I'm like, but like you see people like decay and like lose
Not
everything,
good.
and like that's not even if like everyone wanted to die eventually, it's not how you want to go. So
Exactly.
we have amazing technology here in the United States where my grandparents live. And like they're not poor. They could they can afford medical interventions, and yet that's still just nowhere close to enough. It doesn't matter if you're a billionaire. You still can't get past 120. Like no technology is going to save you. And so yeah, that's when I think about like where we are compared to where we could be. I'm like, yeah, we're still really falling short. And that's sad, but it's also really exciting because these problems like are problems that could be solved with technology. Like there's no fundamental reason that they can't be solved that way. So I'm like, great, well let's solve them and survive along the way, and then there you go.
I love that. Well, I want to talk about this big lever point you've kind of mentioned here, which is definitely underrated in the mainstream. I would say it's this point that AI at one level, first thing we should be very concerned about it because it could take our jobs, but maybe it kills us all first. And if one thing, you said something really interesting earlier about rats, right? And this made me think of your evolutionary biology background and the thought that humans have been pretty good at making other species go extinct. Animals that are not as smart as we are pretty good at making them go extinct if we want to. There's cases of this. I'm curious, is that the key thing we should be worried about with AI? Is that if being that is smarter than us decides we're not worthwhile, or it's just like misaligned in some weird way, it could just come and just wipe us off the planet, hunt us down wherever we are, and there's really nothing we could do, even if we're on Mars. It doesn't matter where we are. And this is the true X risk because at some level, it could not be recoverable. Almost all the other X risks are recoverable in some sense. Maybe we can go to Mars if there's severe asteroid impacts or nuclear war or something like that. But at the end of the day, AI could be a scenario that's coming quickly that could go so wrong that we can't survive it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people talking about this space and thinking about this space.
Yeah.
And so a lot like most of my ideas are like just trying to gem mine the good ideas that have already been talked about and sort of like respond to like this deluge of ideas. But I think it's really like worth thinking about from first principles and like thinking about like, okay, like, well, if you have a really smart agent and you don't necessarily know like exactly what kind of agent it is, are there things that we can infer about like what it might do? And I think it was like Omohundro who first came up with like this idea of like basic AI drives, which is like what might you expect some agent to do? And there's like a number of things. If you're trying to accomplish some goal, well, like you don't want to be turned off or killed because like you're not going to be able to accomplish your goal if that's the case. And like, yeah, as it applies to humans too. We're trying, we've been very incentivized by evolution to survive and reproduce, so we're like very generally don't want to die, but also like wanting to acquire resources and generally improve yourself, improve your ability to get stuff done out in the environment. Humans are great at this. We've like learned to really stockpile resources and build tools, and like now we have computers and all these things. So yeah, even though we don't know exactly like how AI systems will think or function, I think we can infer pretty well that like, and I think a lot of people point to current like language models where they're like, look at language models like GPT-3. They don't seem like they have very clear goals. They don't seem very goal directed. And I'm like, yeah, that's kind of true, but like they're also not that useful. Like they're kind of useful. They're kind of useful for like generating cool stories and like for but if you imagine 5, 10, 20 years in the future, people disagree a lot about these timelines, but if you imagine projecting out a little bit and like looking at people who are building more and more useful systems, I bet that the ones that are more useful are the ones that look more agent-like, like the ones that are better at planning, better at achieving their goals. Like, if you were in charge of a big company and you like have some AI that's assisting you with planning, you want the one that's good at it.
Exactly.
And so I think that you can expect these, even though they might have weird quirks and whatever, you can expect AI systems to be pretty rational in this way, pretty smart. And so, I think the key question is like, how hard is it to align their goals with ours? That's one question. And the other question is, how powerful are they? So if they're like a little bit more powerful than us, then there's an interesting question of like, oh, well then like maybe we're like useful, but maybe we're also a threat. So I could see, humanity being wiped out because we're actually a threat to these systems. And then if they're vastly more powerful than us, then, well, we might be wiped out just as a side effect of them changing the environment. Like if there's absolutely nothing we can do to interfere with these systems, they maybe don't care whether we live. But I think there's like a Elias Yudkowsky quote, which is like, the AI doesn't like love us or hate us. It's just like we're made of atoms that can be used for something else. Like we're just material that can be like repurposed. And we don't like to think of ourselves this way, but like fundamentally at the end of the day, we're like made out of these particles, and like we're on the planet and we're shaping the planet. And like if something else starts shaping the planet and then it makes it into something that's not very good for us, like, well, we're not going to make it. And I think people have a really, really hard time imagining a system this powerful. And there's a lot of I think there's a lot of like difficulty sort of imagining something that's like way, way smarter than us. But I think that the question for me is like, how close are we to sort of the theoretical or practical ceiling of intelligence? And so when I was young, I hadn't thought about AI at all. I was imagining science fiction stories, and I was imagining like, oh man, like how might the future go? And I was like, oh, I bet we'll like genetically engineer ourselves to be smarter. Because like, well, people we really value intelligence in our society. You can see that people who are really smart often get really good jobs and like can make really cool technology and whatever, or just are like very politically savvy. So it seems very desirable. This is before CRISPR, but like, yeah, whatever. Genetic engineering is clearly taking off. We're going to get that technology eventually. And then I sort of imagined, I was like 18, so I was like imagining the like soul, like genius scientist that was like in the lab being like, ha ha ha, I will make myself smarter. And then you sort of have this like runaway dynamic, right? Where like the next you become smarter, so you can become even better at making yourself smarter and whatever. And maybe this takes multiple generations, and so like each generation becomes smarter and can sort of reinvest in that. But I sort of imagined a like runaway scenario where humans got smarter and smarter just via genetic engineering. And since then I know a lot more about genome selection, and there's actually a lot of really interesting research into like how this is possible, and I think it is possible. Now, there's a lot of limitations in terms of the human brain and in terms of genetic engineering, but like I think my point is like you can imagine a scenario where humans become a lot more intelligent. I think it's useful to think like what would society look like in that case. But then like the interesting thing is when you look at AI systems, the things that sort of are limiting to us, like sort of how like fast neurons are, and sort of how much can you scale things, just are not present. Like you can just build a bigger data center. You can just like add more compute. And when you look at like the progression from like GPT-2 to GPT-3, and then like all of the newest models, and then like you sort of just like look at like what all these different AI companies are doing and adding more and more compute. It turns out you can like add more data, you can add more compute. Like these systems probably can just keep scaling. And so like when I look at that, my impression is that like the ceiling of intelligence is actually really, really, really high. And so if you do get there, and I think we probably will, you're probably looking at a really big power differential between everything humanity can do and everything these systems can do. And that's the point at which, like, I think we should be scared. Like, because, like, you know, if an alien civilization arrived and they were, like, just thousands and thousands of times more powerful than us and all of the technology looked like magic, you know, I think people would be and should be terrified.
Yeah.
It's like, maybe they're going to be nice to us. Like, that would be, I hope they're nice to us. But, like, we're, like, completely at their mercy. And the scenario that we're setting ourselves up for ourselves with AI is building systems that are thousands and thousands and thousands of times more powerful than us, you know, whatever, I don't know what order of magnitude. And I'm like, yeah, that should be scary.
Yes.
Because that just because of the raw power differential, even if we know nothing else, it should be like, oh goodness. And I think a lot of people like look at these arguments and they're like, I just don't really buy things. And I'm like, that's great. Like, you know, don't take my word for it at all. But like really think about like, what are the cruxes when it comes to, you know, maybe you think that it's impossible to build a system this powerful. Well, great. Like, why do you think that?
Right.
Like, what are the components? Maybe you think that, you know, as you add more compute, you'll get like really strongly diminishing returns. Maybe that's the case. Like, you know, and then make predictions. And then if your predictions, you know, if you think that that's the case, like, you know, maybe try to predict what AI systems won't be able to do. Because like people are often like, AI systems can't do this, and then you like next year they can, and then people like move the goalposts, and they're like, well maybe they can't make, you know, read text and summarize it. Yeah, they can now. So
exactly, and we keep seeing these big advancements. I'm curious. You mentioned something interesting there. How much do you think, like, you know, how far can we get just by scaling up language models in the current paradigms we have? Versus, do you think there will have to be radical, you know, breakthroughs in technology, in AI research for these things to like truly create beings that are, you know, have agency and are scary at some level? Does that make sense?
Yeah. The very short answer is I don't know. And in terms of how I reason about it, like, you know, so I'm on the security team at Anthropic. There's a lot of really smart people there, and you know, just I have a lot of other friends who are in this space who are doing sort of doing work here. You know, mostly really work on alignment, really trying to figure out how to align these systems, and not how do we push these systems, you know, as you know, to be as capable as possible. But they do end up knowing a lot about that. And you know, people disagree about this. I have some, and it's like really hard because I'm like, man, like these are people that I think I really respect. I think their thinking is very sharp, and they have pretty different intuitions about what it will take. My intuition, which I don't really trust here, some intuitions I trust a lot, some intuitions I don't trust that much. I don't trust this one that much. But my intuition is that it will take some other pieces, but I don't think those pieces will necessarily be super, super hard to find.
Gotcha.
The reason I think this is that, yeah, just looking, I've been really impressed with sort of the general intelligence of language models so far, as you scale them up. So when I saw GPT-2, I was like, this is really impressive. GPT-3, I'm like, oh, whoa, this is starting to get coherent. And then, you know, as GPT-3 has gotten better and other language models have gotten really better, I've really started to see this sort of like conceptual clarity emerge. And sort of instead of having to like ask, you know, try a prompt 5 different ways, you just like try one thing and you get a very coherent response. I've had dialogues with language models where they explain nuclear reactors to me, and they you know, I was trying to figure out like, well, okay, you know, I'm very interested in the nuclear space, so I wanted to know like, how come more states that have nuclear power can't easily get nuclear weapons? I was like, you know, maybe if like you're Japan and you want nuclear weapons in a year, that's just fine. In 1 year, you can just have nuclear weapons. And so one of the questions here is like, well, why can't you just take the nuclear reactors you have and use them to like make plutonium, and then you can make bombs out of plutonium. The original atomic bomb, or one of the 2 designs, was a plutonium implosion. So you just get plutonium, you make it in a reactor. Like, great, that should work, right? And so I was like asking the model this. I was like, why doesn't this work? And the model's like, oh, well, that's because you can use a normal nuclear reactor to make plutonium, but the plutonium will also have like one of the isotopes that you'll produce isn't weapons grade, and so that will basically poison the reaction, and you can't use it to make weapons. So you'd have to separate out the isotopes, which is the original hard part, which in uranium enrichment to start with. So you just like don't get that far. It is like, but if you use breeder reactors, then you can totally make weapons grade stuff. And I was like, oh, well, like, are reader reactors harder to make? And they're like, yeah, they're harder to make. They're like more complicated, and they're also, you know, discouraged, so nations don't build them as much. But I was like, you know, I'm just like, I don't think that I think that the model like actually understood the question. I think it like actually understood these concepts. And you know, it's hard to say because we don't have good enough interpretability tools to really know what's going on. This is something I really, really hope we get, because as these systems become more powerful, we need to understand them. And I can see no way that can be safe if we don't understand what's happening under the hood. And we certainly don't right now. So like, shout out to Chris Ola's work, interpretability. We really need that. And anyone else who's doing good work in interpretability, I'm just very happy to see that field advance. But yeah, I mean, but I guess what I'm saying is I see those language models having that conceptual, it's as if I was having a conversation with you. Yeah, there are some important differences. You know, that model will not remember that conversation. If I have 20 more of those conversations, it won't remember the first one or whatever. There's a very limited context window. So that's the difference between our conversation and that conversation. But other than that, it's not that different as if I were talking to you about nuclear reactors. And to me, I'm just like, oh, we've just already got a bunch of the core components of general intelligence. And it makes, and so, you know, there's solving the like sort of like planning and memory and all this stuff might be really hard. It might take some big breakthroughs, but I also could imagine some like cool hacks working. So I'm somewhat agnostic. I don't know. You know, it's hard to say. I hope it takes lots of conceptual breakthroughs, because that would mean we're further away, and that would be good. We really need a lot of time here. But I don't know.
Right. I think that's a great. If you plot the line out from, you know, GPT-2 to GPT-3, and you keep plopping that out and just kind of off into the future, like you can get really scared really fast about how good these things could be. Jeffrey, I'm curious, and this is kind of a weird question, but I want to tie together a couple of things you talked about. You know, the first nuclear bomb, the Manhattan Project. You know, whenever I think about when humans have had solved really difficult technical challenges in a really short amount of time, it has generally been because there is like some human enemy we're worried about at some level. So, you know, if you think about the Manhattan Project, you think about the Apollo program, both of these were directed against some kind of foreign human like entity at some level. And people would work 8 hours a week to really try and like defray these threats at some level. My worry with like more non-human threats, when I think about COVID or I think about, you know, like AI alignment, is that at some level, it just seems like less charismatic in people's minds, and it's less vivid than if it's like a real human enemy. And so maybe people work less hard for real reasons. They're less likely to solve collection action problems among themselves to like solve these problems. Do you think that is a real concern we should have about alignment? Is that it's a non-human threat, and so perhaps at some level it's just like less charismatic, and it's harder to get people excited about it, to work on it, and really put a lot of time in to try and solve these things?
Yeah, I think I just straightforwardly agree with you that it's harder. It's harder because of this, right? And I was a bit disappointed, with the response to COVID.
Yeah. It was really bad. Yeah.
Maybe this is naive of me, but I was hoping, you know, I remember, so I like helped organize biosecurity conference Catalyst in San Francisco for February 2020. And we had it, everyone met, and we're like, you know, if it had been a week later, we probably wouldn't have met in person. But we were there just before, yeah. So we're like, and we were talking about COVID, we were talking about transmission, and sort of trying to estimate, you know, what might the response look like. And some part of me was like, yeah, maybe the world won't rally. But I was like, I don't know, maybe the world will rally around this thing. And like, you know, I guess if I'm being charitable, we did do a really great job. In some ways, you know, like, vaccine production, I thought was, you know, we made a ton of vaccines. We made them very quickly, you know, in terms of historical precedent. We maybe could have done better, but we did a bunch of things really well. But in terms of like the vibe or something, or in terms of the cultural impact, it feels like the world just did not unite around this thing. And that's sad. So I'm like, well, that should be like 1 point away from this, like, people will see the danger from AI and, you know, band together to sort of try to defeat this thing. And yeah, I think it is a bit of an uphill battle, and that's like unfortunate. That being said, I know a lot of people who really see these risks, and in the past like 2 years, I've seen tons of people who, you know, some of my smartest friends who previously were not interested in this, just like being exposed to it and sort of hearing these arguments and finding them pretty compelling, and really engaging with them, and then sort of wanting to be like, hey, can I work on this? And so, like, you know, on one hand, yeah, it seems pretty hard to motivate all of society to get behind this. On the other hand, I've seen lots of people very motivated to work on these things. And so I kind of hope that, maybe a targeted approach could be really helpful here, where, we try to find people who, can work on this, do find these arguments compelling, sort of do see the risk here, and then go from there. Like, maybe that's enough.
Definitely. I like that. Going off of that, there's another analog. I just love this analog with the Manhattan Project. In that, the Manhattan Project was a very centralized effort. It's General Groves. He goes and he finds Oppenheimer, and no one wanted to hire Oppenheimer because he was like a socialist and all these things. And General Groves is like, no, he's the guy, and like lobbies for this. And you've got this classic kind of two in the box management team. And they're going through like here in East Tennessee, and they were just like raising farms, and they're like building all these like all across the U.S. This really like impressive like effort. Do you think at some level the alignment community needs more coordination? I mean, it's a real challenge because it's not the federal government doing it. They can't just like go and like seize Google laptops and these defense production mandates, right, to make these things happen. But would we be better off if there's a little bit more, I guess, top-down command control in the alignment community, or is it better to have like more people just working on diverse things because we don't have a great plan yet?
Yeah, so I think how I would describe the field of AI alignment, I've heard other people describe it as pre-paradigmatic,
Gotcha.
Which seems accurate to me. There's not a really established paradigm for like, here's the most promising approaches. A lot of people are trying a lot of different stuff, and I think that that's probably the right thing to do right now. So, people going out and trying stuff and, really trying to like build a strong research community that's like looking for good approaches, I think that's really valuable. So I don't think that, I think I really want good discussion and sort of good, intellectual interchange between different groups so that we can try to identify good strategies. I think that's super useful. When it comes to more on the deployment or more on the sort of scaling side of things, for the companies that are working with big models or are explicitly pursuing AGI, that's where I think coordination is really important. There's been a lot of like debate on Twitter recently about like, is it like good that people are pursuing AGI sort of really aggressively? I think it's actually pretty dangerous. My hope here is that sort of the leaders of all of these AI labs will work together, because like we really all lose if we don't if we're not very careful. And I think the level of caution we need is pretty extreme. And I also think that the leaders of these orgs are not dumb, and I think that they have thought about these things. Like I saw Sam Altman like retweet Eliezer Yudkowsky's like list of reasons for AGI ruin, which is this very intense list of like, here are all of these big problems that are not solved right now that would really cause us to go extinct from AI if we continue in the current direction. And Sam Altman, which is leading OpenAI, which is like explicitly pursuing AGI, is like, I agree with everything on this because it's super important. And I'm like, that's great. Like, I'm very happy to see that. And I'd be very happy to see, the leaders of all of these orgs, collaborate and, maybe, figure out how to proceed in a very, safe and hopefully pretty cautious, like, hopefully extremely cautious way. I don't know what that would look like. But I don't think that is, I talked to some people and they're like, that seems, really hard. And I'm like, well, it seems hard, but it doesn't seem impossible. And I think if you look at like the cultures that these people come from, like they're pretty similar. Like, I think they have pretty similar goals and they're trying to do similar things. And, I could imagine a much more hostile, like, environment where people were like extremely competitive and racing really hard. And that's not the feeling I get when I talk to people, and I have lots of friends in these other orgs, and that's not the feeling I get. Like, people are actually, really happy to talk to each other. And so I'm like, well, we should leverage that to be able to have something that's more coordinated. I think everyone agrees that coordination is important. And I think that there's just some really, I want the really practical things to happen. And so, I'd say, the thing for people who are close to these circles is just to say, like, encourage that. If you're hanging out with some of these people, be like, yeah, hey guys, what's the plan for collaboration here? Like, this seems very important and it seems very dangerous. It seems, so like, how can we make sure that this is not being done unilaterally? I think just like, putting some friendly pressure there is a good idea.
That's great. That's great. I think it's the right approach, and I do agree. I think these people are generally friendly and willing to work together in a way that it's not always common in the real world, which is good and lends itself to collaboration. I want to talk a little bit about security in your work in context of AI. I'm curious. It seems to me that a lot of security at this point has to do with actually solving human problems, like what do humans do poorly, and how do you optimize around that? Am I off base on that? Mm-hmm. Is it primarily technical? Is it primarily humans? Is it kind of this crazy interplay between the two?
Well, it's definitely a crazy interplay between the two. But no, you're totally right that like some of the biggest challenges are human challenges. We sort of do know how to build secure systems. We sort of have all of, we humanity broadly, there are lots of people who are just extremely good at like making secure technology. But you do have a problem as you get more and more complex. It becomes harder and harder to secure. That's both technical complexity in terms of like, how many things is your computer system doing? And that's also social complexity. How many users and developers and admins and all of these things do you have? So and social, and then there's the social side of things where it's like, how easy do you want it to make it for people to use your systems, access your systems at a privileged level? It's very easy to make something secure and then throw it in the ocean. No one can ever use it. It's just not very useful. So there's all of these trade-offs. So yeah, I mean, we can totally go into specific examples, but at the end of the day, humans have to use these systems, and so there's going to be I'm blanking on the word, but you're going to like have attack surface. Like you're going to have an attack surface that is those humans. At DEF CON, there's a social engineering village. The main thing they do is they call up random people at random companies, and they get different points for different pieces of information they can get those people to give them. Like these people should not be giving them any information. They are not working for their company. Yeah. They're just random people at DEF CON. And they go through and they're like, hey, yeah, could you tell me the serial number on your laptop? But first they say, hey, how are you doing? Like, I'm calling from here's this IT department, and like, yeah, we're just like doing some troubleshooting, and we noticed like your system has some problems, and so yeah, give me the serial number for your computer. And
I'm assuming most people give it to you.
Yeah, the people are really good. Yeah, so
how do you think about coaching people? Like, what are the low-hanging fruit in terms of making things more secure? If you're trying to coach somebody, like you're talking to me, like, hey man, like you really need to get your security on point. Like, what's a big thing that's a pretty easy intervention for people to kind of, I guess, implement in their day-to-day life?
So I think there's three really good, obvious things that everyone can do. Which one do I want to start with? Well, yeah, one, keep your computers up to date. The software is vulnerable, or software, people discover vulnerabilities in software and they exploit them. But generally, people also report these. The software vendors, Google and whoever, patch these vulnerabilities. And so you just need to keep your computer up to date. So, if you're using Chrome in the top right, there might be a thing. If it turns red, or even if it turns yellow, or just says updates available, just try to keep clicking that, keep it updated. Same with your operating system, same with your phone. Use hardware that's fairly new and that's still supported. So that's one thing. If things get sufficiently out of date, then you have problems. The next thing I would say is use two-factor authentication. A lot of the way, so there's a number of different types of two-factor authentication. The sort of strongest form is use YubiKeys. So basically, if you want to really lock down your stuff, you have really important accounts. I think people's social media accounts are often way more important than they think. Maybe you already know this, but you sort of think it's just sort of run through the mental exercise in your head. If you got locked out of your Gmail, how bad would that be for you? If you never had access to your Gmail again, how much would you lose? Same with your Facebook, same with your LinkedIn, same with your Twitter, whatever you use. And so for those important accounts in your bank as well, use strong two-factor authentication. And I think there's two things to remember here. I used to tell people I just tell them how to do it, and then there's a big flaw in this, which is that you also need to be able to access it. So it's not just important that you have two-factor authentication; it's important that you always have a backup. So the thing I recommend to people is just get two YubiKeys, get two Yeah, YubiKeys, it's a little USB dongle that you plug into your computer and then you tap. If you get 2 of them, you can leave one like with your passport somewhere secure. You keep the other one on your keyring. You should always have it with you. You don't need to actually use it that often. It's like maybe once a month or so where you actually need to like reauthorize on an account. But this just makes it extremely hard for anyone to phish you, to hack you in any way. And then you have that backup, so you should always be able to get access. There's also like authenticator apps, like Google Authenticator is pretty good. You could like say use one YubiKey or use Google Authenticator. The problem with Google Authenticator is if you lose your phone, now you just don't have. If you only had used Google Authenticator, you lose your phone. Now you just don't have your second factor, so it doesn't satisfy the backup property. You could use 2 phones, but so it's like a little tricky. And then there's some websites only allow SMS-based 2-factor, so you get a text message. This is not good because SMS is very insecure. People can hack your phone, whatever, or not really hack your phone, but people can SIM swap you, where they basically call up Verizon or whoever and say, "I need to change. Hey, I got a new phone. My name is Jeffrey Ladish," but they're not Jeffrey Ladish, and then they port over your phone. And there's not that much you can do about that. There are a few things, but and so SMS is not very secure. In general, phone numbers are not very secure. However, if that's the only thing that some banks are really terrible and they only allow SMS-based 2-factor. It's still much better than not having 2-factor. So like having 2-factor just makes things much harder to hack, even if it's a phone number. So I'd say set up 2-factor wherever you can. That will protect you a lot. Make sure you have a backup. That's pretty good. The last thing is don't reuse passwords. So use a password manager of some kind. The issue with reusing passwords is even if you have a really strong password, you have like randomsite.com and you have a cool forum on that site and you use a password there. Someone hacks that site and they crack all the hashes and recover your password, and then they just try out that password on every other site you use. It's very easy. They can just like enter your email, enter that password. I've just seen many people get hacked this way. So just don't do it. So use a password manager, even if it's just like the one built into Chrome. It's just way better. So because it's just a very common type of attack. So yeah, those are the 3 things. Keep things updated, use strong 2-factor, don't reuse passwords. Honestly, for most people, like that will just get you're just actually pretty good. Like you're probably never going to get hacked if you do those things. You're probably going to have a pretty good time. Like what's awesome is that security for like the end user has actually gotten a lot better. If this were like the like late 90s, I could tell you a lot of things you could do and like none of them would be sufficient because like, you're like Windows XP or whatever would just be vulnerable and could be hacked even if there just weren't updates of it. So like we've actually come a long ways in terms of what's possible and in terms of like how secure so maybe one more slightly advanced thing is I think like buying hardware if you're buying a new phone, I would recommend either getting an iPhone or getting like a Google Pixel. The reason why is that like Google and Apple are just like among the best in terms of like making secure hardware and software. And if you get like a different Android phone, you're trusting Samsung or some other company. Gotcha. That's way less good. And so you're sort of like relying on them to deliver Google security updates. They might be slower. They might add janky software that has vulnerabilities. This is maybe not the most important piece of advice, but if you're trying to be a little extra careful, I would say do that. And also make sure that the phone you're using is still supported. So unfortunately, Pixel 3s are not supported by Google anymore. So just like, if you have a Pixel 3, I'm like, you should probably upgrade. Like, I don't know, don't use an insecure phone.
It'd be a good idea. That'd be a good idea. I'm curious, what about messaging apps? Is it are messaging apps like Signal superior enough that it's worth using them?
I really recommend people use Signal. I think it's useful to think about your threat model here. So it's not that I don't think that, say, like Messenger is not secure. It's actually it's pretty secure. If you have a strong 2-factor authentication on your like on Facebook, Facebook supports YubiKeys or security keys, so you can totally do that. I do that. But the thing is that the government can just like say, hey, this person's sus. I want to look at your stuff. And there are some protections in place, but I don't know, like why risk it? If you're doing something sensitive and you want to just like have more assurance that some government can't access that, well then you just use end-to-end encryption. So Signal is end-to-end encrypted. Signal doesn't get to see what messages you send, and so that's just you just have that extra layer of protection. You can also set disappearing like a timer for disappearing messages, so that you don't have to do anything additional, so that you know that your like message record will disappear. I think there are lots of things that are illegal that are not bad, and I think people should generally do good things. And so, yeah, I mean, there's lots of things that someone who is trying to attack you could potentially use something that you did that was technically illegal, though perfectly fine and just, to come after you. And so you should protect yourself against things like that.
It's quite wise.
So. Yeah, and I'm like, it doesn't matter
Right.
what political ideology you are. Like, if you are for any political ideology, there is something that you believe is totally good and right and just to do that is illegal, probably where you live.
Definitely.
So, like, for anyone, you should like have the capability to coordinate with other people. Don't
Right.
kill people and stuff, but you should like, you're an individual person. You should be free. You should like have the ability to communicate with one another securely.
I love that. I love it. No, it's a great point. It's a great point. Jeffrey, I'm curious. You're super interesting to me because you're interested in security at all these different levels. I'm curious. Were you first interested in security, or was evolutionary biology first, or did they come along beside each other and then kind of like you brought these two together, thinking about X risks and how do we use security to help prevent some of these problems?
Evolutionary biology was totally first. Yeah. So I was at the Evergreen State College in Olympia. I was studying evolutionary biology with Brett Weinstein, Heather Hying, and I sort of I was there and I was like, what's interesting here? Like, who's teaching interesting things? And that was just like, by far the most interesting thing. And I started studying that, like learned about like phylogeny, sort of how different animals are related to each other. I'd also like been reading Richard Dawkins' books, like The Selfish Gene, and that was just like a really excellent take on sort of like the mechanisms of evolutionary theory. And shortly before then, I had been very religious. I grew up Seventh-day Adventist. So, like, when I deconverted, I was like, wait, okay, evolution is true? First of all, that's wild, because I grew up very creationist. I read all the creationist books. I knew all the creationist arguments. And so I was like, well, okay, I think that evolution is probably true, but it just doesn't make any sense to me. I have no idea how this works. So I was trying to figure out how it worked, and I read The Selfish Gene, and I was like, oh, wait, whoa, there are actually mechanisms here. And, like, you can make predictions using these mechanisms. And I was just, like, so blown away by that. Once I saw that Heather and Brett were teaching this sort of evolutionary theory, I was like, oh, that's amazing. I want to go and learn this. So I was learning that, and I was doing some bat research and some monkey research, and I don't know, I've always been interested in computers too. And so, like, at Evergreen, there was a hacking club, and they did CTFs, and they did something called Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition. And, like, basically what happened was I was doing all of this bat research and, like, recording bat echolocation calls, and I had all this data on one of my laptops, and I totally messed it up. And so one of my friends who was like in this hacking club helped me like fix it and like restore everything. And I was like, that's amazing. Like, you can just like boot into Linux like from and just like operate the command line. And I was like, I want to learn all that stuff. And so I just like fell in with that. And then I was thinking about existential risks and thinking about sort of, all the large scale stuff. And it just seemed like this might be a practical skill that could be useful. And so I was like, yeah,
I love that. Jeffrey, I'm curious, if one of our listeners is interested in security and AI alignment, what's a good place to start? Where should they go?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I think there's a lot on the EA forum about like alignment, so there's like Less Wrong, there's the alignment forum, there's the EA forum. I'm seeing more people post about, so there's a lot of people posting about alignment on, the alignment forum, as you expect. And I think that from there and from Less Wrong, you'll see a lot of like resource, like just like, people pointing at introductory guides. I think there's a few good like courses that you can take that are sort of people have tried to like, bring together a bunch of the sort of fundamentals. And I'm really hoping to see more people sort of trying to get into some of the theory and some of sort of the first principles when it comes to specifically security in AI systems. I think that, it's actually a hard field, but I think it's like a very good field. So we haven't really talked about rationality per se explicitly that much. But I think I'm a really big fan of this way of thinking because security is alignment even more so, but security also is a very hard field because you don't get very good feedback. The feedback you get is pretty sparse. So, like if you're looking at securing your laptop or your phone or your accounts, you might be like, well, I haven't gotten hacked, so like, am I really in danger? But if you only get hacked every 10 years and someone, destroys all of your social media and all of your bank accounts, that's actually really bad. So you're trying to like be calibrated by an event that only happens every 10 years, and that's just difficult because you don't get good feedback. And so in the cybersecurity space, it's difficult because people have different hypotheses about they have different threat models, and so I was just at DEF CON and I was talking with a bunch of friends, and people were like wildly different in terms of their level of paranoia because it's DEF CON, there's tons of hackers, and people are like, oh my goodness, like maybe they'll find like a 0-day in the Bluetooth protocol, and they're like hack your device, so you should have Bluetooth turned off. I'm like, should you have Bluetooth turned off? How big of a risk is that actually? And it's actually an important question. Because there's so many trade-offs in security, if I'm at an AI org and I'm trying to, like help users secure their systems, if I'm like causing them tons and tons of trouble for something that's not going to protect them that much because that threat wasn't realistic in the first place, if I'm like, you have to use air gap for every single system has to be air gapped. Well, they're never going to be able to get anything done. So like that's probably not a good idea. Maybe something should be air gapped, but like you need to be calibrated. You need to have a realistic threat model in order to do a good job. And so I'm actually pretty excited about seeing more people post on the EA forum, more people post on Less Wrong and the Alignment forum about some of these theoretical and applied security questions, because I think that like often, and this is throwing shade a little bit, but I think often in the InfoSec world, people like to talk about what's flashy, people like to demonstrate exploits, and they do a poor job of being calibrated, they do a poor job of just having really rigorous epistemology. And I'm like, well, the stakes are too high here. We need rigorous epistemology. Like, let's try to build a community of people who are they're not just going to, let's not just talk about flashy exploits and vulnerabilities. Let's try to be calibrated. Like, let's try to make good predictions. Let's try to have true beliefs. I think that's the thing we need. And like, that's definitely the thing we need when it comes to alignment. You have the same problem, except it might be like, maybe we only get one shot, or maybe we'll get a few shots. Yeah. People disagree about that, but either way, we probably don't have a lot of chances to get this right. And as these systems, like the more powerful these systems are, presumably the worse mistakes are. And eventually they're unrecoverable. And so that's a domain with very bad feedback. So we need to be extremely rigorous in our thinking. So yeah, so I think if you're interested, there's like definitely resources, people can get involved. But I also want people to think about like it's not just a matter of like going out and like reading some content, it's also a matter of like improving your thinking. Like we need to be really good. So it's like it starts with like trying to improve how you reason, becoming more calibrated. So I think it's like it's not just knowledge, it's not just content. It's also like practice.
Getting better thinking. Like skills. That's great. Well, Jeffrey, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today. Where can people find you on the internet? Where should we send them?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Jeff Ladish. I used to go by Jeff. I go by Jeffrey now, so it's a little confusing. But that's probably the best place to follow my work. I also have a website, jeffreyladish.com. And I post on the EA forum and Less Wrong sometimes as well. So any of those places are fine places to.
Good stuff. Thanks so much, Jeffrey.